And so I've gone and just created a new substance up in File, New Substance. I made sure that we set it to physically based, and we want to make sure that we set our size mode to relative to parent so we can change the size anytime we want. So the first little bit is just going to be setup. If you're used to this, you can just skip down below in the timestamp in the description for you, and we can get started. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to add a base material. And so we can just set this guy over here, and if we right click and hit view in 3D, you're going to see that it's going to show up on our 3D object here. So if we come into our parameters for this guy, we're just going to use him basically as a quick reference for us to see our things in 3D. So we want to change our material preset down to dielectric. So it's going to make it more like a white or gray plastic. And then we want to expose a few maps that we can input our own geometry into our node here. So I want to come down to normal, and I want to come down to height as well. And so we're going to expose these two guys right down here. So I'm going to plug in a normal map into this input. And now any grayscale information we plug into this node will be converted into a normal map and will be displayed over top of our mesh. So now that we've got this base setup done, we should be good to go on starting our bricks. So we're going to start out by creating the brick geometry or the brick pattern that we're going to use to create the basis of what our bricks are going to look like. So luckily in Substance Designer we have a brick generator down at the bottom here, which does most of the heavy lifting for us. As you can see, it's given us this nice brick pattern, and it's given us a bunch of parameters that we're going to be able to play with in order to create the bricks that we want. So I'm going to take this guy and run him into our normals, and I'm also going to run it into our height, and you can see it's going to show up in our 3D view here because we're using this base material as an output for our view. So the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to see this height information, because right now all it's showing us is the normals, and if I get rid of that, you can see that all of our data is lost. So if I plug that back in, the way that we can go about getting our height map to show up in the 3D view is if we come up to materials, we go to default and edit here, and we come over to our parameters, you're going to see that there's a height option, and we want to bump the scale all the way up. And take a look in the 3D view here when I do that. As I bump it up, you can see that it actually takes the geometry and pushes it into our mesh here, and that's because we're using the parallax occlusion height mode. So you can see if we come into here, physically based, you can see that we're using the parallax occlusion, and if we use tessellation, it's going to extrude it from the geometry. Now this is a little bit more taxing on your system because it's using physical geometry, whereas parallax occlusion is only a visual illusion or an effect. So we're going to go back to parallax occlusion just for optimization. And now that we've got our height working, I want to come back to our normal map, and I just want to increase the normal intensity so that it's a little bit easier to see our geometry. So if I come over to intensity and I increase it to something like 5, now it's going to be a lot easier for us to see our bricks. And this is a start for creating our material. And so now we've got our brick generator here, and I'm going to go in and play around with some of the parameters to just kind of get more of the look that we want to achieve with our bricks here. And so if I go into our parameters, you can see that we get a lot of different options to really make the bricks that we want to make. And so immediately what I can see here is the number of bricks that we can use on the X and Y axis. And you can see, just like a tile generator, it's going to tile our brick shape across both our X and our Y here. And it's going to give us different looking bricks depending on how much we actually tile. So I'm going to put this back to 4 by 8 because it's going to give us the perfect rectangular brick shape that I want. Our next option is the bevel, and if you can see in our 2D here that the bevel is actually the distance from the face of our brick here to the gaps in between. And you can see when I play around with this, the less bevel I give it, the shorter distance it's going to be, or the steeper gradient it's going to be between the two. And you can see in the 3D view here what it's doing to our bricks. It's just making them a lot sharper and less of a gap in between the faces. So I'm going to put these both to 0.1. Just so it gives us a little bit of a lip, but nothing too drastic, because we want to have most of our brick being the outward face of the brick and not the sides in between where our mortar is going to be. As we keep going down as well, you can see that we get a gap option, which again just increases and decreases the gap in between our bricks. And so I'm going to leave that down to 0 as well, just at the default, because we're going to actually take a grout or mortar texture that we create and we're going to blend the heights together. So this is going to give us just the perfect space in between the bricks to have a realistic looking brick material. Next, if we go down to middle size, you can see that when we play around with this guy, it's going to swap or shift the axis of our bricks here depending on which brick in the chain or the order it is. And if we play around with the Y as well, you can see that it's going to decrease some of the Y axis of the bricks as well. And this is going to give us a lot of versatility in the bricks that we're going to create, because it's going to give us a lot of different looking shapes and sizes. And this will be something that we will expose later, so that when we're in the game engine we can play around with this to give us totally different brick materials on the fly. So I'm going to set this back to default, and I'm going to take just the X and bring this down to about 0.35 so that we get a little bit of breakup in the length of the bricks. As well, height, you can see, is going to randomly shrink and decrease or increase the variance in the sizes and the heights of the bricks. And if you decrease the max, you're going to get a very mismatched looking result. And again, playing around with the balance while you've got these, it's going to give you a random selection between the two, as well as variation is going to give you gradiated effects and not just a binary black and white. And this is going to allow you to create a whole slew of brick heights and give you a more organic look. So I'm just going to play around a little bit with this guy just so that we get a nice kind of organic look. And nothing too drastic, just so that we get some bricks kind of uneven with each other so that it doesn't look too man-made. The next option we have is the slope, and this is going to allow for us to create a gradient that's going to do just as the title says and slope our bricks so that they're a little bit uneven, like they're pressed into the wall and sticking and jutting out just a little bit. And you can see in our 2D texture here, as we play around with it, we're going to get some gradients that are pushing our bricks farther and farther into the wall. And if we decrease this, you can see the effect that it's taking. And again, if we do that with the Y, we're able to slope the bricks in different directions. And again, the balance and the variance, just like up at the height, is just going to determine how much and the varying degrees with which your bricks are sloping around. So I'm going to come back and reset those. And I'm just going to increase the X, increase the Y slightly, and I'm going to turn the variation up. In this way, we're just going to get our bricks to look a little bit more mishmashed and organic looking. Lastly, we have the offset, which is just like the tile generator, and we're able to push around our bricks and make them look not so tiling or patterning, because you can see with our mid-size here, it's created a bit of a diagonal between our bricks, and we don't really want that. We want to break it up a little bit more. So if we play around with the offset, you're going to see that we are able to shift along the bricks and either line them up perfectly or splay them around a little bit. And if we do variation, it's just going to give us a random offset of our bricks here. And so now something like that looks pretty good. So now that we've got our brick patterns situated, I want to go and create a bit of an edge wear to the bricks to make it look like they're not so manufactured and man-made. And you can see that they're very straight and very 90 degrees. And I want to kind of break that up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the brick generator back here so we have a little bit more space. And I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us a nice divot out of our edges here and make it look so that it's not so straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a Gaussian noise as our input here for our slope, and I'm going to plug that guy in. And immediately it's going to give us these god-awful looking results. And we're just going to play around with our slope blur. If we double click on him, you can see the result that's giving us some nice lava lamp looking detail, and that is not at all what we want. So if I go and increase the samples, and I decrease the intensity, you can see that it's going to slightly resemble bricks a little bit more. And I'll bump it down to something like 0.14. In our 2D texture here, you can see what it's doing is it's adding a little bit of wave and a little bit of eat away or edge wear to our material. And we can still affect this by coming down into our Gaussian. And if we increase and decrease the scale, we're going to get a whole bunch of different effects. And this is going to give us larger divots in our material. And this is going to give us more smaller ones. And you can see it's even playing around with the geometry of the face of the brick as well. And so I like to have my edge wear a little bit larger. So I'm going to come back and decrease the scale a little bit. Something to around 24 looks good. And the last thing I want to do is I want to come back into our slope blur. And I want to make sure that we want to switch the mode down to min. And you can see that the difference between the three modes is that blur is going to try and blur both of the min and max together. Min is going to tear away a little bit at the darker values, or the lighter values, resulting in the darker values. And max is going to try and bridge some of the lighter values together. So we want to come down to min just because we want to tear away from the edges a little bit, so we get these little lips. And so now that we've got these three done, I'm just going to highlight all of them, and I'm going to come up to this guy here, and we're going to put a frame around it. And I'm going to come up into our parameters here, and I'm just going to type in brick pattern and hit enter. And so now that we've got this framed, we know that whenever we're going to need to find where our brick pattern is, we've got an easy point of reference for ourselves. So now that we've finalized our brick pattern here, I want to go and start creating our deterioration of the brick and some chunks that have been taken out just from the wear and tear of the world. So I'm going to bring this guy back, and I'm going to start by creating our destruction off to the side here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a cells 1 node, and this is going to be the basis for our deterioration on the bricks. The first thing I want to do with this is I want to add a directional warp because it's looking a little bit too soft. So I'm going to add a clouds 2 node just to be the input for our intensity here. And you're going to see that it's going to give us some interesting looking effects. Now, off the bat, we're not going to get too much for 2 different reasons. 1, the intensity is very low, and 2, the scale for the cells is very high. So I want to come back and I just want to decrease the scale of our cells here so that we get some larger detail. Coming back to the directional warp, I want to come to our intensity and I want to switch it to 500 just for now so that we get some visible details of what's going on. And you can see as we warp this around, we're going to get a whole bunch of different effects based on the clouds here and, again, the parameters that we set for this guy. So going back to the intensity, we can start to bring this down. And I want to have something a little bit closer to, we can say about 65. And this is going to give us some nice noisy detail that we can use to overlay on top of our bricks. So with that, I'm going to just create a blend between our slope blur over here and our warp. And you can see when we overlay it, it's just going to verbatim overlay our noise in our cells up top here. And you can see this is the kind of destruction that we're going to get from our bricks. So now I want to come down to blending modes, and I want to come down to where it says divide. And you can see now it's going to take our lighter values from our directional warp, and it's going to eat away at our material here. And so now what I want to do is I don't want to have that much destruction or deterioration on our bricks. So I'm going to add a levels node on top of our directional warp here. And I'm going to start by bringing up the black, and I'm going to decrease the white output to make the overall texture darker. And you can see now that it's leaving a lot of the rock faces, but still having a little bit of deterioration geometry. And so with that, I'm just going to take these guys here, highlight them all, and I'm going to add a frame around them as well. And I'm going to call this brick deterioration. So now that we've got the deterioration of our bricks out of the way, I want to go ahead and create kind of the brushing, the brush strokes of a brick, and kind of the nice smooth stripping that you get, which are just a natural byproduct of creating bricks. So I'm going to bring all of these guys back. And I'm going to go and create, off to the side here, a creased node. And you can see this gives us a nice kind of sweeping effect. And just kind of like the deterioration, I'm going to add another directional warp onto these guys. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to select from our slope blur grayscale here, and I'm going to plug this guy into our directional warp. And you can see as we zoom in, you start to get some creasing like you would from our bricks. You can start to see some of the geometry of the bricks over top of our texture here. And so if we bring this guy up to around 500, we're going to get a bunch of different warping directions, and this is just going to allow us to organically create the brush strokes for our material here. And again, if we play around with the degrees of the rotation or the warp angle, we can kind of get any effect that we want. So now that we've got these guys, I'm going to again add a blend onto our chain here and plug this guy in over top. And you can see what it's going to look like once we overlay this texture on top of our chain, that we're just going to get some nice subtle brush strokes. So when I come over to the blending mode, I want to go down to add sub. And you can see that it's going to take some of our darker values and just kind of subtract them from our bricks here. Now it's a little bit too harsh, the intensity that we have it now, and so to fix that, I'm just going to take our opacity and bring it right down to something like 0.03, and this is just going to give us some subtle brushing of our bricks and add just a little bit more interesting detail over top. And now that we've got that, we can again play around with the direction as well as the intensity if we need to find something that better suits our material. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to go in and just add a bunch of air pockets all around our bricks here. So I'm going to bring these guys back. And I'm going to start by adding a tile generator. And with this guy, we're just going to make our shapes for our little air pockets here, and we're going to just tile them around using one node. So we're going to come in, and I'm going to come down to where we have our pattern here. And I'm going to come down to paraboloid, and we're going to get these little soft bubbles. And this is going to be perfect for the geometry that we're going to want to overlay on our bricks here. We can also play around with the X and Y amount, but for now I'm just going to keep that at 10 until we mess around a little bit with some of the other parameters. So once we get down here to size, we can play around with the scale uniformly, but we can also play with the random scale. And if we play around with this, we're going to get, just like it says, random scale between each paraboloid or each geometry here. And this is going to be perfect to give it a more organic look. So we can crank this up. And again, playing around with scale, we don't want something too large because we're going to be overlaying this on top of our bricks. So we want to have them relatively small in comparison to our bricks here. And I'm going to decrease the randomness just a little bit, and again bring that down to something like 0.15. As we come down to position, we can change kind of the orientation or the actual position in space of our geometry here. So if we play with the offset, we're going to get a bit of a uniform offset like we did with our bricks. As well, if we play around with the offset random, we're going to get a little bit of a randomized offset. And playing around with the seed is just going to further randomize the results that we're getting. As we come down further, we're going to get an actual X and Y random, which is going to affect each geometry individually. And you can see if we scale up the X, they're all going to move on their own individual X-axis. And the same thing for the Y. If we increase this up, now it starts to look a little bit less rigid and man-made, and a little bit more chaotic and organic. Again, we can play around with the global offset, which moves everything uniformly. And just playing around with these parameters is going to give you some interesting results. And if we scroll down further, we're going to get a bunch of different color parameters. And if we start checking things off, you can see that they're going to start eliminating some of our geometry here. And you can use this to give it, again, a more organic look and remove some of the geometry that we're getting. As well, we can play with our random mask, and it's going to randomly remove some of our geometry. And I'm going to bring the random mask up to something like 0.1 just to get a little bit of space in between our divots here. The last thing that I want to do is I want to come down to blending mode, and I want to make sure that this is on max, so that if two of our bubbles here, our pockets, are overlapping, they're not going to create a solid white color, but more so make it look like they're intersecting with each other, which is going to give a more realistic result and not just result in a flat surface for our height. So now that we've got that done, I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to run him through a directional warp node. And for our intensity here, I'm just going to add another Gaussian noise, and I'm going to plug this guy right into the bottom. And you can see that with this, we're going to get a little bit of stretching of our divots here. And again, we can play around with the rotation of all of this. We can also play around with the intensity, and we can play around with the scale of the Gaussian noise to give us a bunch of different results. And so something like that looks pretty cool. So now I'm going to blend these together with our chain by adding a blend onto this guy. I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And you can see right now it's giving us the top geometry here, our air pockets. And we want to subtract the lighter values of our pockets here from the values of our lowered mesh here. So I'm going to come over to our blend, and I'm going to come down to where it says subtract. And so now it's going to take all of the lighter values of our air pockets, the white values, and it's going to remove them from the white values of our underlying mesh here. And we're going to get some pretty sharp divots that dig right into the mesh. Now that's a little bit too sharp for my liking, so there's two ways we can go about decreasing this intensity. We can come back to our tile generator here, and if we scroll down, we can change the global opacity, which is just decreasing the opacity of the entire texture. Or we can come down to our blend, and we could just decrease the opacity right here. And so I'm going to stick with our blend and just decrease the opacity down to something like 0.2. And this is going to give us some nice looking divots and just nice looking air pockets. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a bunch of cracks running through some of our bricks here. And how we're going to do that is we're going to start by creating a cells2 node. And with the cells2 node, one nice thing that we have is the ability to change the width through our parameters here. And this is very handy if we want to come back later and make our cracks thinner or thicker. I also want to decrease the scale just so that we can see what we're doing a little bit easier. And so now with this guy, I'm going to run it through a slope blur grayscale because we're using a grayscale image as denoted by our gray sockets here. And I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to just increase the samples for now. And we're not getting any results because we haven't actually put anything into our slope factor here. So what we want to do is we want to create a fractal sum base, and this is going to give us some nice grayscale information that we're going to use to kind of deteriorate the edges of our cracks here. So I'm going to plug this guy in, and you can see right now it's giving us a very noisy looking texture. And that's because our intensity is way too high on our slope blur grayscale here. So if we take that guy down, you can see that it's now starting to resemble the original image. So we're going to bring this guy down to something like 0.4. And if we zoom in, you can see that it's giving us like a stained glass kind of look to it. So if we come over to our fractal sum base, we also have some parameters that we can play around with in here. So I'm going to make sure to double click on this guy so we can see what we're doing, and I'm going to single click on our fractal sum to bring up its parameters. And so you can see that bringing up the roughness makes it a little bit blurrier, and we want to have a bit of a sharper edge to it. So by bringing it down, you can see that we're eliminating a little bit of that excess noise and giving us more of a tearing kind of look, which is kind of the look we're going for. We can also increase the min level and decrease the max level to give us some different looking results. And this is more the look that I think we're going for, because we get some geometry that's both digging in and sticking out of our cracks here, which is going to be perfect for overlaying on top of our bricks. And so the next thing that I want to do with this guy is I want to start warping around our cells here, because it looks a little too rigid and a little bit too man-made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our slope here and I'm going to add it to a warp. And I'm going to take another Gaussian, gotta love the Gaussian noise, and we're going to plug this guy into our warp here. And you can see it's going to give us a little bit of that gobbledygook mess, but if we just decrease the intensity and we play around with the scale of our warp, we're going to get us something a little bit nicer than what we had before. And you can see that, again, there's not too much of a difference. So maybe increasing the intensity a little bit and decreasing the scale, we get something a little bit nicer. So I'm going to add this guy over top of our chain here by adding another blend. And I'll plug this guy right in. And so we're going to get all of the cracks that we have over top of our material here. And I want to come into our blending mode. And I'll go down to multiply. And what that's going to do is get rid of all of the white areas of our cells here. And it's going to overlay all the black parts on top of our texture, so that we're just getting the recessed areas of our cells here. Another thing that I don't like is, again, how deep our cracks are. And so I'm just going to come back up and I'm just going to bring down the opacity a little bit so that we get something a little bit shallower. And again, that's still a little too deep. So I'm going to bring our opacity down to around 0.2 again. And that looks pretty good. But now we run into the issue that we have our cracks running through our entire material, and I only really want to have some cracks running through some of the bricks, and some of the bricks are left untouched. So what we're going to do is we're going to come all the way back to our initial brick pattern here, and we're going to take this guy right here and we're going to add a levels node. So we're going to take this guy and plug him into a levels. And what I want right now is I want to just have our bricks as a pure white, and I want to have our crevices in between the bricks, or our gaps, pure black. So I'm going to bring up our black values and our white values here, just so that we get a fairly binary value. And you'll see why we're doing this in just a sec. So I'm going to add a flood fill node, And so what this node is going to do is it's going to convert our binary white and black map into something that's usable for other filters, other flood fill filters or nodes. And you can see that on top of this guy, if we just type in flood, we get a whole bunch of different flood fill nodes, which do a bunch of different things. And the node that we're going to use is going to be this guy down here, which is the flood fill to random grayscale. And so we're going to plug this guy in. And what you can see is that it's taken all of our bricks and just applied different grayscale values over top of each one. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these three and I'm going to bring it back over to where we've got our cell cracks. And I'm going to add a directional warp over top of these guys. And the reason that I've added a directional warp is because I'm going to use this grayscale, random grayscale map as the input for our directional warp, so that our cells or our cracks look a lot more like they are following the contour, the geometry of our bricks. So if I plug this guy in and we take a look, you can start to see that there is a little bit of a gap between the areas where we have our mortar and our brick. And if I start to play around with the angle, you can see that each brick is isolated and it's separate from the rest of the bricks. And if I bump this up to something like 100, now we've got each brick as its own separate entity from the rest of the bricks. So it doesn't look like there's one large pattern just repeating over top of everything. So that looks pretty good, but that doesn't fix the issue that I had where I only want some of our cracks to show up on only some of the bricks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a histogram scan node, and I'm going to plug our flood fill random grayscale into this guy here. And you can see initially we just get a black texture. And if we come into our parameters here, when we bump up the position, it's going to give us different grayscale values, and it's going to show the values at different positions. I want to bump up our contrast so that it's more of a binary on and off. And that's what we're going to use for the opacity of our blend here, is just as a form of a mask or an on and off switch, where only some bricks are going to have our cells texture and some of them are just going to be the normal brick. And if I plug this guy in to our opacity, you can see it immediately takes effect where we've got cracks on some of our bricks here, and then some of our bricks are just nice and smooth from the geometry that we created before. And again, playing around with this, we're going to get less and less, and as we bump it up, we're going to get a pure white texture across all of our bricks here. So I'm going to bump that down to something like 0.05 because I only really want to have a couple of bricks, and maybe I'll bump this up to, we'll do 0.08. Get another brick in there just so that we get some variety in our cracks. The last thing I want to do is I want to come back to our cells because I don't like how thick these cracks are. And so I'm just going to bring down the edge width again to something that looks a little bit more realistic. And we can also play around with the scale to add more cracks to our bricks. Or we can do something a little bit smaller and add just nicer looking single cracks. And so now for the last part of our brick geometry, what I want to do is add all of the detail that we're going to get in between our bricks with the grout or the mortar and all of that information that we're going to need. So the first thing I'll do with that is I'm going to come over here And I'm going to add a fluid node. And this is going to give us these interesting looking kind of raindrops or like dripping concrete. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a height blend node. And I'm going to take our blend here in our chain, and I'm going to plug this guy into the top, the height top there. And I'm going to take the fluid, and I'm going to plug him into our height bottom. I can see now what we're going to get is a blend between the two grayscale geometries here. And it's going to be relative to how we actually input them in our node. You can see that if I plug in the fluid on the top here, and our bricks on the bottom, we're going to get our fluid showing up over top, and it's going to be more prevalent when I play around with our height offset. So increasing more of our top geometry here, or increasing the prominence of our bottom geometry. So while you can do it both ways, it's just good practice to think about which node is going to be over top of the other one from a geometry standpoint. So we're going to keep our fluid guy in the bottom here, and I'm going to bring my bricks and keep them in the top. And now we can play around with our offset just a little bit to get different results. And you can see as I decrease the height offset, we actually get part of the fluid node down here sticking through our bricks. And so let's go ahead and plug this in, and we can see what it's doing in real time. So you can see we start to get some things popping through our bricks here. And as we increase our height offset, our grout sinks away or sinks back into the bricks. So we can decrease this a little bit so that we're able to see some of our grout coming through. And another thing that I want to do is I want to increase the contrast to 1, because you can see in here what we have is these kind of sharp lines, these sharp dark spaces between our grout and our bricks here. And if we increase the contrast to 1, it just blurs that out a little bit and makes it a little bit more seamless. And now the next thing that I want to do is I don't like how we get some of our grout peeking through the middle of our bricks here. It's not very realistic as to what would happen. However, I do like that it pops out a little bit in between the bricks there, and we really want to kind of keep our grout sticking within the bricks and not actually going on top of the faces here. And so with our height blend node, we actually have a mask input here that we can use to drive the position in the areas which we're going to get our grout. So in order to start with our mask, I'm going to go all the way back to where we get our brick pattern here. I'm going to bring this guy over and plug him in. And so with this, what we're going to get is just a straight gradiated mask, which is not very conducive to what we want because it's a non-binary visible and transparent mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a levels node on top of this guy, and I'm going to hit F because he's highlighted, and it will bring us to wherever this node is. And I'm going to bring him over. And so I'm going to double click on our height blend here, and I'll single click on our levels so that we get to activate and play around with them. And as I bring the parameters or the handles towards each other, you can see kind of the effect that we're going to get. So the black areas in our mask here are going to be where the grout is going to show up in between our bricks, and the white values are going to be where our bricks are without any of that grout information showing up. And you can see areas that are a kind of a grayscale mix are going to have more of this grout material showing up. So as we increase the white value, you can see that that's going to slowly peek out. And as we decrease the black and increase the white, we're going to get a very binary mask. Now what I need to do is I need to just play around with the height offset a little bit so that we're going to get a very sharp looking material with our grout in the middle there. And you can see we still get it showing up just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the height offset just a little bit more. And now we're going to get this banding effect because our mask is a little bit too small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just bring back our white values just a little bit. I'm going to bump up our black as well. And the last thing I'm going to do on top of this is I'm just going to add a blur node. And I'm going to decrease this just so that we get a little bit of a softer fall off. And so now we're going to have our grout that's going to be peeking through the bricks. And we can also go and play around with our fluid as well, changing the scale to get a little bit noisier and smaller geometry there. We can play around with the disorder to move it around. We can play with the warp intensity so it can be a little bit more bulbous and less drip-like, or we can increase that to make it a little bit drippier. We can also play around with the pattern size, and if we take a look at our fluid here, you can see exactly what it's going to do. So increasing the stretch on the X and the Y, and we could do something like 2 to make it even thicker, to make it a little bit less contrasting with the darker values and make it more of a uniform white or gray. And I like something like that. And that's starting to look pretty good. So I'm going to take these guys here and move them over. And we're just going to label this as our grout. So now that we've completed our height information, I want to go and start adding on to our normal information. And the difference between the height and our normal here is that our height is used for actually displacing geometry and actually using polygons to create the difference in the shape of the material or the texture. What our normal map does is takes these RGB values, and each value or each color is corresponding to a different direction. And these directions are used for light calculations and how the light actually bounces off of our material. So this is used more for when we want to create a surface irregularity that is a little bit too small for us to accurately and efficiently capture in a height map. So what I want to do with our normal map here is I want to add both our surface detail for our bricks and for our grout. So I'm going to start by creating a black and white, if I can spell it, 2, and this is going to give us some nice looking surface irregularities, and we're going to get a bunch of different grayscale values. What I want to do with this guy here is I want to plug him into a normal map because we're going to use that black and white values as indication for our surface normal geometry here, or our surface normal information. And just like a height map, darker values indicate recessed areas and brighter values indicate more elevated areas. So it works almost the same way as a height map does. It just does something a little bit different. So you can see when we click on our normal map here, we're going to get a very, very noisy map. And I don't want something this incredibly noisy overlaid on top because I want to have a little bit of breakup in between our surface detail here. So what I'm going to do is add a levels node in between here, and I'm going to start by bumping up some of our darker values. And just like a height map would, a pure black or a pure white value is going to give us a flat surface information. And you can see when I look at our normal map now, we get some flatter areas. And the same thing goes for white values. As we increase our white values, we're going to get some flatter areas. I'm also going to just increase our intensity to 2, just to make things a little bit sharper. And so now we've got some surface breakup. I'm going to decrease the black and make them about even. So now that we've completed our normal map for our information, we need to blend the two together. So what we're going to do to blend these two is I'm going to, on top of our chain here, add a normal blend node. And this is going to allow us to blend both of our normal maps together. So I'm going to take this guy and plug him in on top. Now you can see if we play around with our opacity here, it's not going to show up at all. And that's because we also have this use mask option. And because we have two different height or detail normal map information that we want to do, we're going to use this mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to where we have our blur here that we've created for our grout, and I'm going to plug this guy in to our normal blend here. And you can see once we do that, it becomes very, very harsh, very, very jagged. But you can see that it's not actually affecting a lot of the grout, just more so the edges. So what we can do is, even if we don't like that, we can just plug in the levels node right before it, and it's going to give us a sharper looking contrast. And you can see that it's only affecting our bricks. So what we have to do is we have to come back to our normal blend here, and we just have to turn the opacity down. And you can see as we turn the opacity down, it starts to take more information from our normal map here and less information from this guy here. And so I want to really crank this down because I don't want a lot of information from the one up top. I just want to have a little bit of surface irregularities. But I want most of our normal map to be driven from the one that we've created from our height node here. So I'm going to bring this down to something like 0.1. And this is going to give us a nice, noisy, but somewhat subtle look. And when we can take a look at our normal blend, you can see that we've got just a little bit of surface detail, but we still get the same normals that we got from our original normal map. So with that done, I'm just going to take these guys and I'm going to call them our brick detail. And we're going to use pretty much the same method that we just did for our grout here. So I'm going to take everything and I'm going to push this over so we have some more space. And I'm going to start by adding a black and white spots 3. And I'm going to do a 3 just because I want to have a little bit of different geometry or different surface normals than we did for the brick, just to make it a little bit more distinguishable and different. So I'm going to do the same thing by first adding a normal map onto this guy. And I also want to add a levels node as well. And as I double click on our normal map to watch what we're doing, I'm going to single click on our levels, and I'm just going to start by increasing the black and decreasing the white, just so that we get a little bit of a contrasted look. And I might decrease the black a little bit because I don't want to have too much flat space for our grout here, because normally it'll be pretty noisy with information. So I'm going to bring these guys back here. And just like we did over here, I'm going to add another height blend, or normal blend, sorry, onto our chain. And I'm going to take this guy and plug him in on top. Now we're going to need to have a mask in order to mask off the brick areas that we don't want the normal information to affect. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hold down Shift and left click, and it's going to take the same mask that we've inputted here, and I'm going to plug it into that node there. Now, because we have a mask that's indicating the bricks and not the grout, we're just going to need to invert it. So what I'm going to do is on this guy going into here, just add an invert grayscale node. And make sure to use grayscale because we are using grayscale images for these masks. So we'll take this guy over here, and you can see now that we've got some noise information coming in on our grout. And you can play around once again with the opacity to make it more or less subtle. So I'm going to bring this down to around 0.22. And I'm just going to increase the intensity of this normal map as well to 2. And so now we're getting some nice normal information to accentuate our height information that we've created. And so I'm going to create another frame. I'm going to call this grout detail. So now that we've got pretty much all of our height and our normal information done, I want to go ahead and start plugging all of our nodes into their appropriate outputs. So I'm going to take our base material here, and I'm just going to delete that guy. And I'm going to bring all of these over, so now we can start plugging things in. So I'm going to plug our normal blend right into our normal map there, our normal output. And I'm going to plug our height over here and bring that down to our height output. So for the most part, our normal and our height are done. But we still have a few more outputs that I want to deal with before we continue on. And so now if I right click anywhere in the graph and I hit View Outputs in 3D, you can see now we're viewing this on our 3D mesh, and we're no longer using our base material to view anything in our 3D view here. So you can see it gives us a little bit of a different look, and that's because we don't have anything in our albedo, our roughness, and our metallic outputs. And so first things first, we can get our metallic out of the way because we don't actually have any metallic objects in our material. So with our metallic, I'm just going to add a uniform color, and I'm going to make sure that it's set to grayscale. And so black is going to indicate that we don't actually have any metalness, and if we did have metal items in our material, we would mark those as white, which would indicate to our shader to utilize metallic properties. So from here, I'm going to go back up to our albedo base color, and I'm going to bring this guy up so that we have some more room to work with. So the only thing I really want to do with him right now is I just want to add a color, and I want to come over to grayscale. Just to make it easier for us right now, we will be working in color as we come back to it, but I just want to be able to view things in our viewport a little bit easier. So I'm going to bring up the levels to something that's like a mid-gray tone. And this is just going to make it easier for us when we start looking at our roughness map, which we're going to do right now. So as I come back down, we don't actually have anything going into our roughness map. And what that's going to indicate is basically a black or null value. And in a roughness map, black values or darker values means that it's going to be a lot glossier or a lot smoother. And so therefore we're going to get more of a wet or mirrored-like effect. Whiter values are going to indicate rougher areas, and it's going to be a lot more diffused lighting and not as sharp reflections. So the first thing that I want to do, and that I normally do when creating roughness maps, is I'm going to take our normal map and I'm going to use the edge information that we get from this map. I'm going to create a curvature smooth map, and I'm going to take our normal map and plug him in. And you can see that we're going to get some edge information, which is going to be very useful for when we want to drive our reflections. And as I plug this guy in, you can see that immediately it goes matte, and it's no longer glossy or very shiny. However, like I just mentioned, darker values indicate glossier areas, meaning sharper and finer reflections. And you can see that our darker areas are all in the recessed parts of our material. So in reality, that really wouldn't make sense to have our sharpest reflections in the most occluded or hidden areas of our material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring our roughness over there a little bit, and I'm going to add a levels node on top of our curvature smooth. And what I'm going to do is invert the input and the output so that the rougher areas are going to be white, and they're going to be the areas that are hidden along the cracks and sunken into our geometry here. And you can see this looks a little bit more realistic than when our map was inverted. And as we play around with our dark outputs and our light outputs, you can see that decreasing the overall brightness or value of our material is going to increase the glossiness. And vice versa, if we increase the black output, it's going to make everything a lot more matte. And so I'm going to bring down the bright output and bring up the dark input just a little bit so that we don't actually ever get a pure black and a pure white. And we can also decrease our black value a little bit, and we can increase our white value so that we get a little bit of gloss, but nothing too reflective or too shiny. So before I go about creating the albedo map, there's actually one more output that I want to create that's going to help us further push the illusion of the material that we're creating. And that's going to be the ambient occlusion that we're going to get, or the shadow information that we're going to get in the more occluded areas of our height. So I'm going to come down below our height here, and I'm going to just start by typing output. And we're going to get another output node like we've gotten with our metallic, height, roughness, and so on. And with this guy, I'm going to come into its parameters here, and under usage, I'm going to add an item. And I'm going to go up to diffuse, and I'm going to go down and find ambient occlusion. And I just want to start by making sure that I identify everything that we're doing so that when we use this later, we're going to be able to tell what this node is for. We also want to make sure that we put this in the material group so that if we're using this graph later on, it's going to help us by just making things a lot easier so that we're noting that each one of our outputs is in the material group. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our height information here, and I'm going to use this to drive our ambient occlusion node. So as I bring this, I'm going to put this in the ambient occlusion output, and then I'm going to also add an ambient occlusion node over top. And so you can see that this is going to give us a lot of shadow information that we're going to get from our height. And we have some parameters that we're going to be able to play around with to kind of make this a little bit more efficient for our material. So first things first, I want to just right click in our graph here, and I want to view outputs in 3D again. So now we're going to be able to see what our ambient occlusion is doing. And so right now I feel like it's a little bit too dark, and so what we're able to do is actually decrease the height depth so that the height information that's getting put into it is not as contrasting or stark. And you can see that if we crank this up, we get very, very unrealistically dark information. The last thing I want to do is just hit GPU optimization, because you can see here currently this node takes 197 milliseconds to render or to draw call. And if I hit optimize, it greatly reduces this number. And so now I've come back up to our albedo output, and I want to start working on creating the base color for our material. So the first thing that I normally do is I create kind of a base color scheme that I want to work with for our material, and then I build off of that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come back again to our initial brick pattern, and I'm going to take this output and I'm going to plug this right into our base color here, and I'm going to get rid of that uniform color. On top of this, I'm going to add a gradient map so that we start using color again, and you can see that it's denoted by this yellow line or connector and a yellow socket. And this is going to allow us to use the grayscale input and overlay color information over top. And you can see that when we come into our gradient map here, we click on the gradient editor, we're going to get this spectrum here, and then we're going to get a color graph. And if I just kind of click up into our spectrum over here, or our linear gradient editor, we're going to get the two black and white values, and it's going to work somewhat like a levels node does. And you can see as I increase the black level, our blacks are going to increase to the point where it's entirely black, and the same thing for our white levels. However, what's different about this is that if we click on one of these guys and then we drag around in our editor here, we can change it to any color that we want. And the same thing for this guy over here. We can also add multiple other points where we can do a whole whack of different colors and then move these around to get different effects. So what I want to do is I want to start by just getting a nice base color down so we're able to work off of it. And you can see that because our input is a gradient, we're going to get a little bit of a blend between the two. And so what I'm going to do is just increase the amount or increase the position of our orangey color. I'm also going to bump up the position of our gray. And if we come in here, you can see that the orange is overlapping just a little bit onto the gray. So I want to bring up the gray amounts, but also making sure to watch any blowouts that we're going to have, like over here. And so something like that should be okay, so that we get a nice base color between the two. And now we have something to work off of. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to add some variation in the colors of each brick. And we actually have created a nice gradient to work from over here, where we use the flood fill to randomly grayscale some of the bricks. So I'm going to take this output and I'm going to plug this guy into our base color now, and you can see that we're going to get some randomized brick values. So with this, I'm going to add another gradient map, and now I'm going to blend these two together. So on the bottom one, adding a blend, taking our top input and plugging it in, and then plugging this guy into our base color, it's just going to give us the top result because we haven't changed any of the blending modes or the opacities. And you can see if we go over to our blending modes, we're going to get a whole bunch of options that are going to give us some interesting results. And so I like the soft light result as it gives us some interesting looking geometry here. But you can see that it's also affecting our grout, and we don't want that. We just want it to affect the bricks. So if I come back down to where our grout is, you can see that we've already created a mask for our bricks. So I'm going to take this guy here and I'm going to plug it into the opacity of our blend. And now you can see that it's only going to do the bricks and not even touch the grout. With this, we can also play around with the opacity so that we get slightly contrasted bricks, or we can get very diverse cast of colors for our bricks. So I'm going to bring this down to something like 0.5 because I just want to have a subtle difference in values for our bricks. The next thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of detail to our cracks here, because right now you can see that it's still using the color that we have over top of the bricks and not its own kind of color information. So I'm going to add another blend, and I'm going to go over to where we have our cracks. And you can see these are the final results for the cracks that we're going to get on our material here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to plug it over top of our gradient here, or our blend, sorry. And you can see that we're going to get this red line. And that's because we are plugging a grayscale map into a color blend, and you can see that that's denoted by the blend over here and its color input and output. So in order to fix that, all we need to do is add a gradient map onto that chain, and if I hit F, you can see that we've got our grayscale input and our color output. And so we just need to make sure that we are conscientious of those discrepancies and those color conversions when we're working in our graph here. And so with this, we're just going to get a black and white map. And that's going to be perfect because in our blend, all I want to do is get rid of the white and keep the darker values. So in order to do that, I'm going to go down to our multiply option and hit that. And you can see now it's going to give us the darker areas. And if we decrease the opacity, it's going to give us a little bit of breakup in our material here. But now we run into the issue of having crack information where there actually is no normal or height information. And so again, we just need to mask off the areas, and we've already created a mask down in our cracks here. And you can see with this, we're just going to be able to plug this in, and boom, all of the non-essential cracks are gone, and they're only in the areas that we've denoted with our mask. And you can see in here, we're just getting the areas that we actually have cracks. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to go and start creating some variation for our grout here. And so again, I'm going to add a blend node, making sure that we have more space. And I'm going to go down to our grout detail here, and you can see that this will be perfect for our albedo because we're using this to drive the normal information. And so if I bring this guy up here and plug him into our blend, we need to make sure that we have a gradient map in between the two. And we're going to get some cool information over top. Now again, we need to make sure to mask this off, and how we're going to do that is I'm just going to again control and click on our input here and bring this in. Because we have the white areas as our bricks, it's going to show up in the bricks and not in our grout. So all we need to do is get an invert grayscale node, And now you can see that we've got it just showing up in our grout areas. I also want to play around with our blending modes a little bit just to see if we can get some interesting looking stuff. And again, so I like the soft light blending mode, but I just want to bring the opacity down just a little bit. And we can take a look in here that we're getting some different information. And so now our material is starting to actually take on the form of a brick wall. The next thing I want to do, however, is I want to add some more color information to edge wear of our bricks, because right now they look pretty uniform and they don't look like they've really been weathered at all. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to come down to where we've gotten our levels here, and I'm going to go to our curvature smooth. And this is going to give us those nice brighter areas along the edges that we're going to use for our edge wear. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another blend along our chain here. Go back down to our curvature smooth node and plug this guy right in up top. Again, adding a gradient map. And you can see that it's going to give us some nice highlights of our edges that really would be worn out from wear and tear. And so I'm going to come into our gradient editor here, and I'm going to bring up our black and white values here. And I really want to crank up the black so that we get most of the material looking black except for the edges, which we're going to keep a nice white. And I'm going to come into our blend here, and I'm going to go down to where we have screen. And what screen is going to do is get rid of all the black values, and it's only going to keep the lighter values. And so now we've got some edge wear on top of our bricks. I'm just going to come down now and decrease the opacity a significant amount to something like 0.25. And this is just going to give us some nice edge wear of our bricks. The final thing I like to do in our Albedo is I just like to add a sharpen node. And this is just going to sharpen up some of our destruction information, and you can see it's a little bit too blurry, but as we increase it up, we get a little bit of a crisper looking detail in our map here.